All right, folks, here we are with my version of the week 10 assignment. So I'm starting off here again in Illustrator, and I'm using the self-portrait composition that I used for last week's assignment. You don't have to do this, but I was really happy with how this came out, and I wanted to add some interactivity to it. So feel free to make your own composition if you'd like to create a new one. So part of my goal here is I want the eyeballs to move around and basically follow the mouse. Now, since P5 doesn't really support clipping masks the same way Illustrator does, I decided to sort of cheat and make some ellipse shapes that were just lining up with the boundary of the eyeball white shapes and using layering just to make it look like the iris and the pupil could sort of pass underneath those shapes, kind of like you see here. So to do this, I use the offset command from the object menu in Illustrator. Basically, it takes a shape, makes a concentric version of it a specified distance away. So by turning off the interior fill and using a heavy stroke weight, I was able to get these boundary layers around the eyes that pretty much act like a clipping mask would in Illustrator. So I'm bringing that into P5 just using the coordinates from Illustrator. You can see here I'm doing it with a black stroke so I can make sure that it's lining up in the right place, and then switching to the skin tone stroke color. So now I want to set up some variables to keep track of the location of each of the eyeball shapes that I need to move around. So I'm going to the reference and I'm looking for a kind of a variable that's going to keep track of two pieces of information at the same time, right? Because each of those shapes has an X and a Y location. I don't want to have two separate variables. So this one I'm looking at is called create vector. This is an object data type, and this works very similar to the color object data type that we looked at in the how to use data types for variables in P5JS video from this week's micro lectures. So essentially, this is keeping track of two pieces of information in one variable, and I could use this for the X and the Y of setting a location. I could use this for a width and a height. So declaring my variables up here at the top of the sketch, and then realizing that I need to do the initialization in setup. So copy pasting that out of there and just making sure everything is in the right place in my code. So I'll have one variable for the left eye, one for the right eye, each keeping track of the horizontal and vertical location of each of those shapes. So just getting those set up here, copying in my values, and then just plugging them in to the ellipse functions that are drawing those shapes. So I had to sort of think this through as I went and realized that some of these eyeball shapes weren't moving, right? So like the whites and the boundary ellipses aren't actually moving. It's really just the circles that are making up the pupil and the iris of each eyeball. So just making sure I'm putting those variables in the right place, and then getting the mouse location set up to control the location of those variables. And I'm noticing here some of my layering is a little bit screwed up, so I'm just moving some stuff around so that that overlap actually works in my favor and makes it look like the eyeball is moving. I'm also noticing that right now, the way that this is set up, the eyeball is following exactly the mouse right at the center point. But if I do that for both, they'll be right on top of each other. So I'm adding in some offsets for those shapes so that they're to either side of where the mouse cursor is, and they look like they're moving together. So that's working pretty good. Obviously, the eyeballs are traveling way too far outside the boundaries of the eyes. So I'm going to use the map function to basically constrain their motion. So I want to look at the location of the cursor, which can be anywhere on that canvas, and I want to map it down to a smaller range, side to side and up and down, so that those eyeballs stay over the whites essentially. So I'm making some local variables here just to process that information and make things a little bit more readable, using that map function, plugging those into my previous code, and then just kind of adjusting the range of motion that I'm giving to these shapes. You can figure this out lots of different ways. You can guess and check. You can go to Illustrator. You can sit down with pencil and paper and figure it out mathematically. Whatever works for you. I usually do kind of a combination of all those things. Just going back and forth in my code, referencing, the locations of shapes and making adjustments as I go. I'm finding that the eye location looks pretty good in terms of where they can move, but I need to maybe increase, I think, those boundary shapes a little bit. So I had to go back to Illustrator, make some adjustments, get the coordinates, pop them back into P5. Again, you don't have to work this way. You don't have to work in Illustrator at all. You could do this all by hand. You could do this from Photoshop. I just like Illustrator because it matches up pretty well with the shape functions in P5. So you can see just make some tweaks here. That is looking pretty good. I found it hilarious to look at my own eyeballs watching myself write code most of the time I was working on this, so that made this a lot more fun and enjoyable. Just adding some comments here. So the next thing I want to work on is getting the background color to change when I click the canvas. So getting a color, setting up a color variable, exactly the same way that we covered in that micro lecture video that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to add in a function mouse pressed event down below my draw block. And this is one event of many that you have access to in P5. And so this is looking when the mouse is pressed and only making changes when that happens. So putting that code in there. So I can see this is working now. When I click the mouse, the background color changes. The problem is it can never change back. So I need to figure out a way to get that to happen. Also, if you need to figure out what sorts of event functions you have access to in P5, go to the reference section. Right at the top, there's a nice little sort of chapter heading section, and you can click on events. And that's going to take you right down and give you a big old list of all these different things that you can track in terms of interaction and bring those into your sketch. So I'm using already mouse pressed. I'm also going to bring in mouse released so that when I let go of the mouse, I can make certain things happen. There's all sorts of other ones here that you can take advantage of. So right now, any of the event functions that have parentheses after them work exactly the same way as how I've set up mouse pressed, where it's its own block outside of draw. The other ones that are here under events that don't have parentheses are a little bit different. We're going to cover how those work next week. So if you want to bring in any of these, just stick to the ones that have parentheses. So bringing that into my code, making a mouse released version. So that is going to let me make one group of settings for when the mouse is being held down, one group of settings for when the mouse is let go. So I can alternate things back and forth. So I'm noticing here something weird is happening when I click and drag the mouse outside the bounds of the canvas. Those eyeballs are moving in a way that they should not be. So something's going wrong in terms of the way that I'm using that map function to keep those eyes constrained to the whites. And I think what's happening for some reason that when I'm holding the mouse down, P5 is tracking the location of the mouse even when it's outside of the canvas. So, the mouse is way over here, so it's something like, 800, negative 300, which I wasn't expecting. But that's okay, because we can process that mouse X and mouse Y information to make sure that it stays within the range of the canvas boundaries. So I'm going to jump back to the reference here, and I'm going to look up a function called constrain. And constrain lets me essentially constrain a number between a minimum and a maximum. So I can use this function to make sure that that mouse X value never goes below 0 and never goes above either the width or the height of the canvas. So I'm just going to bring that into my code here. So making a couple more local variables and passing that mouse X information through the constrain function to make sure that it's staying within the range of either 0 to width or 0 to height, and that should get rid of that weird behavior. And that's looking pretty good. So the next thing I decided to work on was making the lips change shape when I click the mouse versus when I let go. So I'm just doing some testing here to see what sorts of values I need to change and by how much. Again, just working back and forth between P5 and Illustrator, changing shapes, getting width or location values. This ended up being a little bit trickier than I thought it would be, especially because that top shape in that lips group is an arc, and those are just a little bit trickier to scale horizontally like I'm trying to do here versus the way that I would do it in Illustrator. So not everything is exactly the same in terms of the way that you would change a shape. So I ran into a little bit of a roadblock here and I had to kind of go back and forth. But basically just setting up some variables for the width of those shapes, putting them into my mouse pressed and mouse released, and into the functions that are displaying those shapes in the draw block. So doing some tweaks here, getting this working. This is a pretty normal way of working with code where you'll try something, it doesn't quite work, you'll maybe have to backtrack. So don't get too frustrated if that happens to you. What I ended up doing is having to go back in Illustrator, actually draw out ellipses so that I could get the locations and the dimensions of the two arcs making up the narrow lip shape and the wide lip shape, and make sure I was inputting all those into my code correctly, which eventually I was. I also found that I needed to adjust the start and the stop angle between the two arcs, so again, between the wider one and the narrower one. So I used another one of those two-dimensional create vector object data types in a variable, so I could hold both the start and the stop angle in one variable. So the last thing I wanted to work on was my smile lines there, making two sets of those. Again, thinking about the way that the cheeks would be changing if I'm going from sort of a smile to like a pursed lip sort of a shape. And so setting up two more create vector variables to hold the x and y coordinates of the endpoints of each of those lines. And that's all I needed to change was the endpoint. I could leave the start point the same, closer to the base of the nose there. I found that I was having some issues in terms of getting the right coordinate location from the transform panel in Illustrator. Because these are straight lines and not Bezier curves, I needed to actually get the direct selection tool, the white cursor, and just click right on the point because I was accidentally taking the center point of the line instead of the end. So pretty normal part of working this way is, you'll think you're doing it right, and then something either looks wrong or goes wrong, and you'll have to go back and reevaluate. So that's about where I ended up. Had a lot of fun with this one. Again, you don't have to use your self-portrait. You can use any composition you want as long as you have three forms of interaction that somehow substantially change the image. That could be image hierarchy, that could be color palette, that could be scale, that could be atmospheric perspective, just for a few examples. So hope you have a lot of fun with this one.